Good morning. I'm here, fresh out of bed, wearing last night's makeup with unbrushed hair to talk about why poetry is important. Poetry is important to me because it's at the center of the way that I think. You can describe something that happens to you or something that you see in a literal way, but it's so much more colorful when you use a metaphor. It makes the world just a little more beautiful. My love for poetry began as a child. I had two wonderful parents who read to me whenever I wanted. So I imagine that as a very small girl, it was Jack Perletsky and Shel Silverstein who sort of brought poetry to my life and made it accessible for me. I remember in school, particularly in high school, I wasn't a giant fan of poetry because it felt inaccessible to me. It felt like a thing that was just out of my reach. I knew there was something going on there. I felt like there was a mystery under the surface, but I wasn't necessarily getting to that level of what was going on until I got to college. In college, after 7 years of changing majors, I landed as English because English had always been easy for me. And it was really when I started studying medieval and Renaissance poetry, and particularly John Donne, that I really started to love poetry and multiple meanings and parallel structure and the form of poetry. All of that is the very analytical way that I came to love poetry, but that's not really what is at the heart of poetry, and it wasn't until I started writing it. In college, I went through a terrible breakup, I remember, and I had resolved that I was going to write one poem every day for 30 days, and I was going to hone my sort of skill at poetry through getting over this heartbreak. And I learned a lot of things. I learned what terrible poetry looks like, but I also learned to appreciate good poetry when I saw it, and I learned sort of how you craft words to evoke emotion. My real love of poetry began when I went to my first poetry reading, and I realized that poetry was the vehicle that would take me to the place where I would get coffee, because coffee is the thing that my life runs on. And as a poet, I kept a notebook. Here's my very first poetry notebook. It looks like the Book of Kells. It is well worn and held together with duct tape like all poetry notebooks should be. It's well used. Every single page is full. It's got notes slotted into it and all sorts of other nonsense. And there's some terrible poetry in there. And there's some good stuff too. And I use that as a tool because when I grew up, I became a high school English teacher. And I, every year, have to teach poetry to my 9th and 10th grade students. And just because I love it doesn't necessarily mean that they will. So I tell them right off the bat, you know, it's okay, I'm not going to try and change your mind. I'm just going to show you what poetry is, and I'm going to let you decide what it is. And it's unfortunate that this call for videos came during spring break, because I would have loved to have had my students tell you a little bit about how they have changed through poetry. Because the most telling thing was in my 5th period class, a week before we went out on spring break, so it was a week ago last Tuesday, my student said to me, poetry makes feelings real. And I said, can you explain that a little bit? And they said, well, feelings aren't necessarily a thing that you can define. They're not a thing you can point to. They are a thing that, you know, it's abstract. It's not something that you can say, that is what this is. You know it when you see it. You know when you see love. You know when you see sadness. You know when you see anger. And that student said, poetry takes that feeling and makes it an actual thing. And so I assume they were saying that it makes it tangible to them. Poetry is a way to make their feelings tangible. And I think, wow, they taught me something. Poetry is so important to the world and to our day-to-day life and to description, and it helps students and people think in a creative and beautiful way, in an artistic way. It helps people understand feelings that are a little bit complex. I think the greatest thing that a poet does is a poet helps you understand someone else through what they're saying. Or that poet says, hey, I wrote about this moment in my life, but maybe it evokes something in you. And so I scoff at anyone who says that poetry is not that big a deal or is not important, because it is. And I have 70 ninth and 10th grade students that will tell you that it is as well. Thank you.